Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really interesting question.
hmm
How do we truly understand the economic health of a country? Especially one like Ireland, with such a big global footprint.
Right. It's a fascinating case study.
We're not just skimming the headlines today, we're going deep into Ireland's national income stats to figure out what these numbers actually mean.
Absolutely. And we've got some great material here, detailed analyses, figures from Ireland's Central Statistics Office, the CSO, and other key reports.
So the plan is to get past the usual buzzwords.
Exactly. Give our listeners a clearer, more, let's say, nuanced picture of the Irish economy.
Yeah.
We'll try to keep the jargon down, just focus on the core insights.
Okay, let's unpack this then. And I guess the starting point for most people is GDP, gross domestic product.
That's the one everyone knows, GDP. Basically, it's the total value of everything, all the final goods and services produced within a country's borders in a given period.
So everything made or done physically in Ireland.
Pretty much, it's that geographical snapshot.
And there are, what, 3 ways to calculate it?
That's right. You can look at production, the value added by all the different industries,
No.
or expenditure, everything set on consumption, investment, government stuff, and net exports.
Okay.
Or you can look at the income side, all the wages, profits, rents earned. In theory, all three should give you the same number.
So what was the number for Ireland in 2023? The GDP figure.
At current prices, it was a pretty hefty 510 billion.
Okay.
But here's where it gets really interesting. If you look at GDP per person, but adjust it for price differences between countries.
Ah, the Purchasing Power Standards, PPS.
Exactly, PPS. It helps compare living standards more fairly. Ireland's figure there was 213.
Wow, 213. What does that mean relative to others?
It means it's 113% above the EU 27 average. That was Ireland's second highest in the entire EU. Just Luxembourg is higher.
That sounds incredibly high, like unbelievably prosperous on paper.
It is a striking number. It really jumps out. Suggests a very, very high standard of living.
But I sense a but coming. There's always a catch with numbers that look that good, isn't there?
There definitely is. Because while that headline GDP per capita looks amazing, the real GDP, so GDP adjusted for inflation, it actually shrank by 5.5% in 2023.
Whoa, hang on. So the per person number is sky high, but the overall economy contracted. How does that work?
Well, the contraction was driven mainly by those sectors dominated by multinational companies. If you exclude construction, that's where the fall was concentrated.
So the parts of the economy linked to big global firms went down, even while the overall GDP number stayed high because of their sheer scale.
Exactly. It's a real contrast. So which specific sectors did okay and which didn't?
Good question.
Well, information and communication, finance and insurance, real estate, they actually grew. But the broader industry sector saw a pretty strong decline.
And what about spending? How did that look?
Exports actually fell by 5.8%. That was the first drop since, I think, 2012. Imports, on the other hand, went up slightly, 1.2%. But personal consumption, what people in Ireland are actually spending themselves, that increased by a pretty healthy 4.8%.
Right, so domestic spending was up, but the international trade picture, especially exports, was down, and overall production shrank. This really points towards those multinational corporations, doesn't it?
Absolutely. That's the elephant in the room. Ireland's GDP is massively influenced, you could say inflated by the activities of these huge MNCs. We're talking pharmaceuticals, tech giants, aircraft leasing. They have such a huge presence.
And wasn't there that crazy situation a few years back, that leprechaun economics thing?
Ah, yes, 2015. Unforgettable. Ireland's GDP suddenly leaped by 26.3% in a single year.
26%? That's insane. What happened?
It wasn't, a sudden boom in factories opening or shops being busy. It was largely down to Apple restructuring and moving a huge chunk of its intellectual property assets, patents, trademarks onto its Irish balance sheet.
So an accounting move, basically.
Mostly, yes. A massive accounting move. Paul Krugman coined the term leprechaun economics then. It really skewed the picture.
It shows how vulnerable GDP is to these huge corporate actions. And Ireland's export numbers, you said they were huge relative to GDP.
Phenomenal. Exports were worth 138.2% of GDP in 2023. But here's the key point. A lot of the profits generated by these MNCs don't stay in Ireland. They flow back out to their parent companies overseas.
So the activity happens in Ireland, boosting the GDP number.
Right.
But the actual income, the profit, often leaves the country.
Exactly. So the GDP figure overstates the economic prosperity that's actually felt domestically. It counts the production, but not necessarily the retained benefit.
Okay, that's a really crucial takeaway about GDP in the Irish context. It's inflated, which naturally makes you ask, are there better measures?
There are. And the next logical step is to look at gross national product, GNP, or its very close cousin, gross national income, GNI.
GNI, okay, how is that different from GDP?
GNI focuses on the income earned by a country's residents, regardless of where the economic activity actually happened. So it's about who earns the money, not just where it's produced.
So it follows the money back to Irish residents and companies, even if they earned it abroad.
Exactly. And it adjusts for the income earned within Ireland that flows out to non-residents.
How does it make that adjustment? How do you get from GDP to GNI?
You take GDP and you add something called net factor income from abroad, or NFI.
Net factor income. Okay. What's that made up of?
It's basically the difference between income flowing in from Irish assets or work abroad and income flowing out from foreign-owned assets or work in Ireland. So NFI is primary income inflows minus primary income outflows.
Right. So inflows are things like profits from an Irish company's overseas factory or an Irish person working abroad sending wages home.
Precisely. And outflows.
That would be the big one for Ireland, profits earned by, say, Google or Pfizer in Ireland being sent back to the U.S. headquarters.
You got it. That's the main driver.
Yeah.
So when we look at the 2023 data, Ireland's GNI was $388.4 billion.
Okay, still huge, but definitely less than the $510 billion GDP.
Significantly less. GNI is only about 76% of GDP. That gap, that 24%, roughly represents those net outflows.
So NFI is consistently negative for Ireland.
Consistently and substantially negative, yes. Yeah. Because of those MNC profit repatriations. Remember 2015, the net outflow, the negative NFI, was a massive $53.2 billion just from that Apple IP move.
Wow. Shows the scale. Now, you mentioned something fascinating earlier. GDP shrank in 2023, but what happened to GNP or GNI?
Right. This is where it gets counterintuitive. While real GDP contracted by 5.5%, real GNP, essentially GNI, actually grew by 5.5% in 2023.
A complete reversal. How?
It boils down to those profit outflows. They were actually lower in 2023 compared to 2022. So even though less was produced in Ireland, the GDP drop, less profit flowed out, meaning more income effectively stayed with Irish residents, the GNI-GNP rise.
That really highlights the difference. It's not just about production location, but who keeps the income.
Exactly. It shows why GDP alone can be so misleading for Ireland, given its role as this major hub for MNCs like Apple, Google, Pfizer, and so on. Their profit flows dominate the difference between GDP and GNI.
So GNI is better than GDP for seeing the income of Irish residents.
It is definitely an improvement.
But it's still not perfect, is it? You mentioned it still includes things related to MNCs, like how they account for their assets wearing out.
Precisely. GNI adjusts for the big profit outflows, but it's still influenced by things like the depreciation charges on that massive stock of intellectual property, or on the aircraft owned by leasing companies based in Ireland. These can still distort the picture of the underlying domestic economy.
Okay. So GNI is better, but still inflated by some of these MNC effects, which means we need to dig even deeper.
We do. The next layer down is net national product, NNP, or net national income, NNI.
Net national income. What does the net part mean here?
Net means we're now accounting for depreciation, the wear and tear or consumption of fixed capital assets.
Like machines getting old, buildings needing repair.
Exactly. And importantly for Ireland, also intangible assets like intellectual property becoming outdated or aircraft aging. NNI tries to measure the income available to residents after accounting for the cost of maintaining the country's capital stock. It's about sustainable income.
So it's like GNI, but then you subtract the cost of assets being used up.
That's the formula. NNI equals GNI depreciation, or consumption of fixed capital. It gives you a sense of the income you can consume without actually running down your productive capacity.
And depreciation must be a huge factor in Ireland, right? With all that MNC-owned IP and the aircraft leasing fleets.
It's very substantial, yes. The depreciation charges associated with those assets are significant. We don't have the final NNI figures for 2023 right here, but looking back at 2021, NNI showed strong growth, kind of tracking the recovery, and again, linked to those MNC domestic activities.
And that 2015 Apple event depreciation was a big part of that story, too.
Absolutely. When Apple moved its IP here, it massively increased Ireland's capital stock on paper, but it also brought enormous depreciation charges associated with that IP. That's a key reason why NNI is typically quite a bit lower than GNI in Ireland. A large chunk of the GNI is effectively offset by these depreciation costs, especially on assets like IP that might have shorter economic lives.
So NNI gives a more conservative picture of the income really available.
Yes, arguably a more realistic measure of sustainable income. It's also generally seen as more internationally comparable and less distorted by some globalization effects than GDP or even GNI, although some MNC influences remain.
Okay, so NNI is another important step towards understanding the real picture. But it's not the one we hear about most often, is it?
No, it's not the headline figure, and that really leads us directly to the measure that Ireland itself developed to try and cut through all this complexity.
Ah, okay. The bespoke Irish measure. This must be GNI. GNI star.
That's the one, Modified Gross National Income, GNI. It was specifically created, or rather recommended, by an expert group back in 2016, right after that 2015 leprechaun economics episode, really threw things into confusion.
So as a direct response to say, okay, GDP and even GNI are just too distorted for us.
Exactly. The goal was to design a measure that strips out the main globalization effects that don't really reflect the underlying health or size of the domestic Irish economy. Think of it as trying to measure the core sustainable economic activity generated by residents in domestic firms.
How do they modify GNI to get GNI? What specific things get taken out?
Okay, the formula is GNI minus three main things. First, the depreciation related specifically to relocated intellectual property assets.
Right, the IP moved here by MNCs. Why take out its depreciation?
Because that depreciation often doesn't relate to actual production happening in Ireland. It's more of an accounting flow linked to where the asset is legally held. Removing it gives a better sense of depreciation on assets tied to genuine domestic activity.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second adjustment?
Depreciation on aircraft leasing assets. Again, Ireland's a huge hub, but many of these planes are operated entirely outside Ireland. So their depreciation isn't really part of the domestic economic story.
Got it. And the third thing removed.
It's the net factor income, basically the profits of what are called redomiciled PLCs. These are companies that move their legal headquarters to Ireland, often for tax reasons, but have very little actual operational activity or employment here. Their profits aren't really generated by the Irish economy.
Okay, those three adjustments seem targeted right at the big distortion factors. So what does GNI look like after all that? What was the figure for 2023?
In 2023, GNI at current prices came in at $290.9 billion.
290.9 billion. Compare that to the GDP of 510 billion? That's a massive difference.
It is. GNI was only 57% of GDP in 2023, and interestingly, that percentage has actually been falling. Back in 2013, GNI was about 75% of GDP.
So the gap between GDP and this more domestic measure is actually widening.
It seems so, suggesting those globalization effects are becoming even more significant over time.
What about GNI per person? Does that still look high compared to the EU?
It's still respectable. In those purchasing power standards, GNI per capita was 122, so 22% above the EU average. Not the dizzying heights of the GDP per capita figure, but still strong. In euros, it was about 55,000 per person.
And did GNI show growth recently?
Yes, looking back again at 2021, real GNI grew by a very strong 15.4%. And importantly, the statisticians attributed this to the domestic effects of the multinationals, not those big IP redomiciling events.
So GNI seems to be the measure that really tries to capture the pulse of the domestic Irish economy.
That's absolutely the intention. It's designed to filter out that global noise. The main components driving GNI are things like wages and salaries paid to employees in Ireland, the operating surplus of Irish-owned businesses, and taxes related to domestic production and income. It feels much closer to the ground.
But you mentioned even GNI isn't perfect. It still has some limitations.
Yes, it's the preferred measure, but it's not flawless. One issue often highlighted, including by Eurostat, is the impact of contract manufacturing. This is where global firms pay Irish-based companies to produce goods for them. While the production happens in Ireland, a large chunk of the value might still ultimately relate to the foreign company's brand or IP. This can still inflate GNI somewhat compared to the purely domestic value add.
Okay, so even the best measure has nuances.
Exactly. And GNI is usually reported in current prices, though constant price versions exist for tracking real growth. The key takeaway is, GNI is the best indicator for the domestic Irish economy, but you still need to be aware of potential residual MNC effects.
It's clearly the one to watch for Ireland. But you mentioned other refinements, too.
Yes, complementing GNI, we should revisit NNI briefly and also look at something called modified domestic demand, or MDD.
Okay, N and I, we covered GNI minus all depreciation. You said it was quite resilient to those IP depreciation swings.
Exactly. NNI provides that useful perspective on sustainable income. Less volatile than measures heavily impacted by IP accounting. It showed strong growth alongside GNI in 2021, reinforcing the picture of underlying domestic strength then.
Okay, so N and I is a valuable cross-check. What about this MDD, modified domestic demand? Sounds like it looks at spending.
It does. MDD focuses purely on the expenditure side of the economy. It takes total domestic demand spending within Ireland and strips out those specific, often volatile investment components related to globalization, primarily investment in imported intellectual property and aircraft leasing.
So it's trying to measure core domestic spending by households, government, and businesses on normal investments.
Precisely. The formula is roughly personal consumption plus government consumption plus modified investment, which is total investment minus the IP and aircraft stuff. It aims to capture underlying domestic spending trends.
And what's MDD telling us right now?
Well, for the first half of 2024, MDD actually grew by 1.9% year on year. This is significant because, remember, GDP contracted slightly over a similar period.
So even if overall production, GDP, was down slightly, actual spending within Ireland held up.
Exactly. It suggests the domestic side of the economy remains quite resilient. Consumers are spending, the government is spending, and core investment is happening.
That's a very different narrative from just looking at GDP.
It really is. And forecasts suggest MDD will continue to grow, maybe around 2.7% for 2024, and similar rates in the following years, supported by a strong labor market and hopefully some real wage growth.
So MDD is like a pulse check on domestic activity.
A very useful one. It's a quarterly indicator from the CSO, designed to complement GNI. It's less volatile than GDP because it strips out those big swings in MNC exports and investment.
Okay, so the takeaway is NNI and MDD give us these complementary views. NNI on sustainable income, MDD on domestic spending. Both are crucial for looking past the GDP distortions.
Absolutely. You really need to look at GNI, NNI, and MDD together to get the full picture. And these adjusted measures have big implications when we look at key economic ratios.
All right, like debt levels or trade balances. Using GNI instead of GDP must change those ratios significantly.
Dramatically in some cases. Take government debt. As a percentage of GDP, it was about 44.3% in 2023. Looks pretty manageable, right?
Yeah, relatively low by international standards.
But if you measure that same debt against GNI, the ratio jumps to 75.9%.
Wow, that paints a much more serious picture of the debt burden relative to the actual domestic resource base.
It certainly provides a more sobering perspective. And while the debt to GDP ratio is forecast to fall, starting from a 76% debt to GNI level requires more caution.
That's a huge difference. What about the government budget balance, surplus or deficit?
Ireland ran a surplus in 2023. Measured against GDP, it was 1.5%. Measured against GNI, it looks even better at 2.6%. Both figures compare well to the EU average, which was actually a deficit.
Okay, so the public finances look relatively sound on either measure, but especially good relative to GNI. And trade. Exports.
Exports were 138% of GDP, as we said. But measured against GNI, they're a staggering 242%. It just highlights the sheer scale of those MNC exports relative to domestic income. Similarly, the current account surplus, the overall balance of trade and income flows, was 8.1% of GDP, but 14.2% of GNI, again showing a very large external surplus relative to the domestic economy.
So the bottom line for ratios is always check the GNI-based version if you can. It gives a much more grounded view.
Absolutely. It provides a far more accurate picture of Ireland's fiscal health and its position relative to the rest of the world. And understanding why these adjustments are so critical really comes into focus when you look back at some history.
Let's do that. We keep mentioning 2015 and leprechaun economics. That seems like the pivotal moment.
It really was. That 26% GDP jump, the 19% GMP jump, driven by IP relocation, it just wasn't credible as a measure of real economic change. It made headlines globally, often negative ones, and forced a rethink within Ireland about how to measure the economy. The CSO even suppressed certain detailed data breakdowns at the time because they were so dominated by these MNC flows.
And it wasn't just 2015. You mentioned earlier that even before that, a big chunk of GDP was potentially untaxed MNC royalty payments.
Yes, estimates suggest that between 2010 and 2015, maybe around 23% of Ireland's GDP might have been linked to these kinds of flows, which inflated the headline GDP figure compared to the underlying domestic economy.
And you even suggested this might have links back to the Celtic tiger boom and bust, inflated GDP giving a false sense of security.
It's a potential contributing factor. If GDP figures consistently overstate the underlying strength, it could potentially fuel excessive borrowing, asset bubbles, maybe mask vulnerabilities. When the 2008 global crisis hit, the subsequent crash in Ireland was severe, and having distorted baseline figures beforehand probably didn't help policymakers or banks assess the real risks.
It really hammers home the importance of accurate data for policy. So what are the direct policy implications today of using GNI and MDD for fiscal policy, for instance?
Well, on the fiscal side, as we saw with the debt ratio, relying on GNI suggests more prudence might be needed compared to just looking at GDP. Decisions about spending, borrowing, and managing new funds like the Future Ireland Fund need to be grounded in that GNI reality.
And tax policy. Ireland's low corporate tax rate is central, but complex.
Hugely important. It attracts the MNCs that drive those GDP distortions. But Ireland is also exposed to global tax reforms, like the OECD minimum tax rate and potential trade tensions or tariffs. Policymakers need to navigate this carefully, understanding the difference between reported GDP contributions and actual domestic tax revenue or benefits.
And with MDDs showing solid domestic growth, what about pressure points like housing?
Exactly. Strong MDD growth coupled with population growth, Ireland passed 5 million people, recently puts immense strain on housing supply and infrastructure like transport, water, energy. This reinforces the need for significant, sustained public and private investment in those areas, guided by realistic assessments of domestic demand, not just headline GDP.
And finally, the statisticians themselves. The CSO seems to have been quite innovative here.
They really have. Developing and promoting GNI and MGD shows a commitment to transparency and providing useful data, even if it makes international comparisons harder. But it's an ongoing challenge for bodies like Eurostat and the IMF to handle these kinds of national adjustments when compiling cross-country data.
So the key historical and policy takeaway is you have to use the adjusted measures for Ireland. GNI and MDD are essential tools for policymakers and analysts.
Couldn't put it better myself.
Yeah.
Which really brings us to wrapping this all up.
Okay, let's try and synthesize. Ireland is just a perfect, if extreme, example of how hard it is to measure a modern globalized economy, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
Mm.
And it shows starkly that GDP, while standard, can be a very poor measure of actual domestic well-being when you have such large multinational flows.
We saw GNI and NNI are improvements. They account for profit outflows and depreciation.
But they still contain significant MNC-related distortions, especially around depreciation in Ireland's case.
Which leaves GNI and MDD as really the go-to indicators for understanding the core Irish domestic economy.
They are the best tools available, yes. Though we have to remember their own limitations, like that contract manufacturing issue potentially still inflating GNI a bit.
But credit where it's due to the CSO for developing and publishing these.
Definitely. It's crucial work. So for our listeners, if they take away a few key recommendations.
Yes, what should people remember when looking at Irish data?
Okay, first, always try to find GNI or MDD figures when assessing the domestic economy. Don't stop at GDP. Second, if you see ratios like debt to GDP, look for the debt to GNI version for a more realistic view.
Got it.
Third, keep that historical context in mind, the Celtic tiger distortions, 2015, when looking at long-term trends. And fourth, stay aware of global tax changes, as they could significantly impact Ireland's economic model and its statistics.
Excellent points. And as we said, the source materials offer much more detail for anyone wanting to explore further.
Absolutely. But the core message, the final key insight, is simple. For an economy like Ireland's, looking beyond headline GDP isn't just interesting, it's essential to understand what's really going on. The adjusted stats tell a very different and much more accurate story.
So that brings us to the end of this deep dive. We started with GDP, saw its flaws for Ireland, and journeyed through GNI, NNI, and finally landed on GNI and MDD as the crucial measures for the domestic view.
And the main takeaway for everyone listening? Always question the headline GDP figure, especially for highly globalized countries. Understanding the adjusted measures like GNI is absolutely key.
And maybe a final thought to leave with everyone. How might these lessons apply elsewhere? Think about other countries with big global connections. What might their headline numbers be masking? Something to mull over.
Definitely worth thinking about. The sources we used provide plenty more food for thought, too.
Indeed. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the complexities of Irish national accounts. Until next time.